Welcome to American Architecture Now. I am Barbara Lee Diamonstein, and our guest today is Frank Gehry. Frank Gehry is probably the most provocative, best-known California-based architect in the country. His firm, which has been established for 18 years, Frank O. Gehry and Associates, is located in Santa Monica. He is known for his close ties to West Coast artists, as well as to the notion of the building as an incomplete structure. He is also especially interested in the use of industrial materials and in the making of his art from plain objects such as chain link fencing and plywood. You are a spokesman for what you call, in a rather dramatic exaggeration, if I may, cheapskate architecture. It's the art of using inexpensive industrial materials such as corrugated aluminum, steel mesh, raw plywood, and cinder block to enrich interior spaces. Perhaps you might tell us when and how and why you were first inspired by the idea of industrial materials utilized for aesthetic effect.
I had a lot of poor clients. I guess the first turn-on for me was at the, do you remember the Jewish Museum show on primary structures in 67, I think, 66?
I think long
I ran into Carl Andre's work, and I first got interested in Donald Judd's work. And the idea that that you could make a work of art out of anything. I mean, of course, it had been done by a lot of artists before that, but that really interested me. And I'd worked on, I'd done some work with corrugated metal. It was inexpensive, but for me, the idea was to which I didn't really know I was doing it until, looking back now, I understand kind of what I was doing. I was trying to work more hands-on with the material, and those were easily available to me, so that I took a material like the best example, it's all neatly packaged, is the cardboard furniture I did in the late 60s, where I got interested in the cardboard and actually built structures in the office by myself with my guys, more like a sculptor works directly, rather than doing a drawing and have it made. We worked with it. And I'm not saying that I build my own houses and so on.
Was your first expression of that in an exhibition for which you designed the installation? As I recall, that was in the LA County Museum in about 1968 when you did the installation for Billy Al Bengston.
Right.
Was that the first expression, and what did you do there?
There I used the, well, I was interested in breaking down the institutional look of the LA County Museum so that it would be a nice environment for Billy's work, which grew out of motorcycle racing, and it's his whole aesthetic comes out of his involvement with the motorcycle track. And the LA County Museum just didn't have that kind of, I mean, the institutional quality just fought it. So I did a series of rooms using just raw plywood, and the museum officials didn't like the raw plywood, so they wanted to paint it, so they threw me a curve and brought up plywood that had already been used in other shows that it was already partially painted. They thought that would throw me, so I just left it the way it was and used corrugated metal to make some of the walls to hang some of his paintings on.
And the first job that expressed that aesthetic was a small hay barn, I think, in San Juan Capistrano.
Yeah.
Can you tell us a bit about that?
That was the first time I'd had a project that had the program was sort of negligible. It was just a structure to cover up some bales of hay. And the form it took didn't have any, it could go anywhere. The budget was tiny, So I used a bunch of telephone poles, tilted the shape. I became fascinated with tilted forms and roofs, and I think that grew out of my fascination with Frank Lloyd Wright, actually. And the way he played with roof structures is a very important part of his architecture. And
well, was your intent to build a building or create what you have referred to as a minimal sculptural element?
I hate to use the word sculpture. I've used it, but I don't think it's really the right word. I'm not comfortable using that.
Would you prefer? How would you prefer
Just
to
an
describe it?
architectural element of some kind. It's a building.
Well, it was a building like none we had seen before.
Yeah, I got interested in the when I tilted it, and the reflections of the sky and the metal made the building disappear at some times, and then that proportion of that hay barn came back in a small house I did for Wagner. That's not going to be built, I guess, but it's a similar aesthetic and a similar design. It keeps coming. It keeps reoccurring.
Some architects enrich their early training with stage design or furniture design or graphic work. After you came from Toronto, where you were born, you worked your way through architecture school as a truck driver. Has too much been made of that, this Jack Kerouac California funk connection? Is that really what you're all about? Does that persist in your work? Or is it rather a poetic reference to some of the tough materials that you use?
Boy, I don't know how to answer that one. I'm not.
Well, you still think of the...
I've decided recently, I've been designing a show for the constructivist show that's going to open at LA County Museum.
Can you talk just a bit louder,
Yes.
Frank? I think it might be a little difficult for the people.
I'm working on a show into the LA County Museum that's a show of American-owned constructivist paintings and structures. And I decided that that feels so much like home that maybe my Polish-Russian background is coming out. There might be more to that than to the truck driver or to the... Maybe it's in the genes.
DNA.
Mm.
You describe the building as an unfinished journey. What does that mean?
Well, that's just recently I started. I always find that I start out to do things only with the idea of doing a good job. I don't have any notion of that direction. It's only after the fact that I somehow find words to describe it. And I guess I was interested in the unfinished quality, or the quality that you find in paintings that look like, for instance, in Jackson Pollock or de Kooning or Cezanne, where it looks like the paint was just applied, and the very finished, sort of polished, every detail perfect kind of architecture seemed to me to not have that quality. And so I was interested in trying that in a building. And the obvious way to go about it, I guess, was the wood studs, the unfinished wood studs. I mean, we all like buildings in construction usually better than we do finished. I think most of us agree on that. You know, the structure is always so much more poetic than the finished thing. That I started working with the studs exposed and leaving them that way, encasing them in glass in the case of my house. But it was just that kind of idea.
I tried to uncover the evolution and the genesis of your work. It's obvious to all of us that your intent is certainly not the elegant and hermetic architecture that we see very
I like
often.
marble, you know, don't get me wrong.
We're going to come to those very serious projects of yours soon, those $50 million projects that you happily have one going on right now. But for now, I'm making the contrast to the kind of elegant and hermetic architecture that we generally associate with the East Coast or with Europe, but as contrasted to the kind of Zenga of California and the oriental shores of the West that your work reflects. Does part of it relate to regional differences in taste?
I would guess so. I would think that there's a regionalism in my work, but I'm not sure how to characterize it. I would think that if I tried to do my house in New York, I would have a lot of trouble.
You had a little bit of trouble out there too.
But
is the East Coast more knowing and the West Coast more experimental, and the cliche of the Midwest being
I always
more
thought the East Coast was more open, and there was more I mean, there are more ideas floating around here. There's more acceptance of or seems to be more ideas being thrashed around. In L.A., you don't. I mean, we don't see any. I don't see anybody. We don't get together. There isn't the kind of close, tight circle of architects that you have here, where you're talking to each other every day.
Is that important to an architect's work? And do you think
I think it creates a critical.
In any way suffered as a result of not having the exposure to that kind of critical mass?
Well, I've found it in the L.A. artists who I had a social relationship with, and that. But it wasn't. It was more of a kind of a feeling of what they were doing. It was like a support system. It wasn't, everybody's chopping away at you, peeling back and making you struggle like you do here.
Is that one of the reasons that you spend more and more time here now?
I like it here, yeah.
Well, we're glad that you do. You mentioned that you don't like the kind of architecture that has every ashtray in place, every mise chair in some rigid...
I didn't say I didn't like it. That's very different than what I think I did. I don't intend to say I don't like it. I absolutely do like some of that work.
But it wasn't the
when
kind
it's well done, but it's being done. There are a lot of people doing it and doing it well. And I felt that it was lacking that kind of spontaneity that possibly was worth exploring. And that's what I've been trying to do.
Well,
in other words, nobody was doing it, and it looked like something that would interest me. It's like not trying to duplicate whatever. I guess I approach architecture like more scientifically. Like there are going to be breakthroughs, and you're going to create new information, and it's adding information to the pot, not necessarily regurgitating other older ideas.
And part of your pressing forward toward that cutting edge is your belief in flexibility. Do you think all spaces should be available for architectural improvisation?
Well, I found that the idea of building everything so that it was all set is a hard thing to do with clients, I think. And I'm enough of a voyeur that I like to see what somebody does with what I do. In other words, how they respond to it. Well, I mean, even if they shriek. But
do they?
Sometimes. But my whole architectural growth has been in the area of commercial architecture. It's not been in institutional work. I haven't done a lot of high budget kind of institutional work or theaters, or the theater work I do is outdoor stuff. So most of my work has come from commercial shopping center, spec office buildings, and the idea of...
What a contrast that is to what we're talking about now. Obviously, those are not structures that can evolve in response to the needs of the user.
Well, they do in the sense that they create a shell, and then the user comes in and puts his junk in the shell in some way. So the house I did for Ron Davis was that idea, to build the most beautiful and shell I could do, and then let him bring his stuff to it and convert it to his use. So that it ends up in a, theoretically, in its optimum, is kind of a confrontation between the client's aesthetic and values and my aesthetic and values. And I'm idealistic in thinking that there's a value in that interaction.
You're referring to the house that you did for painter Ron Davis
Yes.
in Malibu. And that house, as I recall, at least having read about, is that there were certain aesthetic ideas that are present in Davis's work that you extended into the architecture, which in turn has led Davis onward in his work and in fact affected his future work.
If he was in the audience, he'd shoot you right now.
Well, how would you reply to that? Perhaps you should comment on the relationship between you, the painter, the house, and the work.
I did learn a lot from him, and I admit it, and I think I feel very strongly about it. And I think I thought he did too, but I think it's not as. I did learn a lot from him, and I admit it, and I think I feel very strongly about it. And I think I thought he did too, but I think it's not as clear.
What of the nature of collaboration between artists and architects? Is that a fruitful alliance? Is it a possible one?
Well, as soon as you separate and you make architecture not an art somehow, when you say that. And I think that both in the collaborations I've had, both of us have been after the same. Our intentions have been exactly the same: to create make a beautiful object, transcend the functional stuff, transcend the programmatic issues, which tend to you know, they tend to create sort of false security of some kind, that the building works for a certain period of time because it solves a particular problem. And so when you start to, in the case of the Ron Davis house, or in the case of the work I'm doing now, where you start to think of the building as a shell and as an object that somebody else comes into, then the intention's is no different than Richard Serra making a piece, in a sense. You know, I mean, there's the same kind of intention, and so I think that it's like collaborating with anybody. It's not.
It's not different than collaborating with another architect or an interior designer.
Well, on the idea with an engineer, it is different, yeah. But I think there's an interesting exchange of ideas. The hard thing is to keep both egos intact as you go through the thing and come out.
Is that possible?
Well, I worked with Bob Irwin on the cardboard furniture, and we still talk to each other.
The interior of the Ron Davis house is a flexible and mobile interior space. Is it true that that house has been reconstructed inside several times, that it has evolved, and I assume that was very close to what your original intent was as well?
Yeah, it's not been reconstructed. It's been constructed in 2 or 3 moves, so that I built the shell, then he came in to live in it with one set of needs, and then they changed, and so we had to build rooms in it. And it was the intention was that the stuff that went in it would be aesthetically different than the shell, so there would be a kind of a confrontation between these two ideas. And what happened is Ron asked me to do the insides. I thought he would do them himself, and he was, I guess, insecure about it. So he asked me to do the insides, so that the inside looks like it's part of the outside. It's very hard to change your aesthetic. I'm finding, I mean, just constantly, I don't know how to do it. It's kind of an elusive quest.
You want to?
Yes. Within a project, I do, very much.
The house has a trapezoidal shape that in some way mirrors the long and uneven hills that surround it around Malibu. Was the shape made by the hills a major concern and influence, or was there some other place that generated the trapezoid idea?
Well, the trapezoid grows out of his paintings. The tilted roof grows out of my preoccupation with the tilted roof. The idea of forced perspective grew out of Palladio. I don't know where. I was nervous about that project because I thought that the extent of the angle, the degree of the angles,
the right angles that fill the entire,
might be too large, and it might get bizarre and make you feel uneasy when you're in it and so on. And it was very restful. In fact, that building unlocked a whole lot of other possibilities for me. And I spent a lot of time there, sitting and looking at it for a lot of evenings, a lot of days, just looking at it, watching the reflections, watching the, which helped me in my house.
What were some of the possibilities that were unleashed?
Well, the idea of you couldn't, because nothing was parallel, you couldn't predict any of the, I mean, this is obvious after the fact, and I should have known it, but you couldn't predict where the shadows and sunlight and reflections. You know, if you got a rectangular box and the windows are rectangular and everything's straight, you pretty much sense where things are coming from. But when they're not, then you get a different take on it, and that became an interesting part of my book that I'm using in my vocabulary on my new work, so that I am playing with reflections in a predictable way now.
You said earlier, when I referred to I guess the house in San Juan Capistrano, I referred to it as some sort of minimal sculptural element, and you were reluctant for me to use that word. But in the past, it's a word that you've used
I know,
yourself.
I don't know what else to use.
And you've used it frequently, and one of the things that you said,
I used
if
it
I
badly.
may, is that you were a frustrated sculptor, that you work in model form and scale models, and you cut away like a sculptor does with clay. Does that still hold true, no matter by what word we describe it?
Yeah, I don't know how else to describe it, but I do work that way. That's true.
Do you still think of yourself as a frustrated sculptor?
I'm not frustrated. That's heavy, huh?
How do you define the difference between the way and the work process, the way an architect works and the way an artist works?
Well, an architect, the process of doing architecture is to work through a set of ideas, through a set of finished drawings given to the field for construction, and everything's got to be on that drawing, or else you get killed with extras and so on and so forth. So there's a process that forces a kind of precision. I mean, it's
costs.
Yeah, but the whole thing forces. I can see why architecture tends to be so precise and finished, because to build in the unfinished idea is very against the system of building, unless you get out there and work hands-on with the materials, which is something I've been urging students to do, rather than go to work with a big office and become cynical in 2 years. It'd be much better, I think, to go in the field and hands-on build. It's a more positive and a more optimistic kind of attitude about work. And when the artists I know that the sculptors work, there's sort of a free play idea. You try things, you experiment. It's kind of a naive, a childish, it's like kids in a playpen. And scientists work that way too. I mean, genetic scientists that I've met and watched and been involved with through a thing I'm in, a genetic foundation I work with, seem to work similarly. It's kind of like throwing things out and then following the ideas rather than predicting where you're going to go. So that artists...
So you press for a predictive quality now in certain parts of your work?
Predictive?
You said that before, that even, I followed what you said, that even the angles can now be predicted, that they're not quite so, I don't know if the word is haphazard or spontaneous.
Well, I think that even I said that. I did. That is a contradiction. What I was saying regarding the reflections is that I was aware now of a different attitude about them, so I sort of deal with it. But then there's infinitely more there than I'm aware of in advance. I'm always surprised.
You mentioned earlier that it was the artists and sculptors in California to whom and with whom you spend a great deal of time talking, and perhaps in a social setting, but nonetheless refining ideas, I assume, larger ideas, if not for specific projects.
No, we rarely talked about our work. It was very interesting. It really was 95% social, but it was like a support system. People would come to my buildings and look at them, and I felt some kind of, the people whose work I respected. So it was that kind of...
To the work of which artists who are now at work do you most respond? Which of them had the greatest influence on your
from out
evolution? From anywhere.
I don't know. Ed Moses was a very important person in my work, only because well, I guess we spent more time together, and there was an attitude he had that appealed to me about working. It was a good role model.
Well, there are a number of artists with whom you are indeed closely involved in California, and at one point you were going to be involved in a collaboration for a house with some of those artists. For whatever the series of reasons, that did not come to pass. And I wondered if you could generalize by saying that there were some barriers, some obstacles to collaboration between architects and artists. If not in general, specifically in that project, if you'd care to talk about it.
I don't remember the project.
Robert Graham and Billy L. Bankston.
Oh, God. Conveniently, I didn't remember. Jesus. Oh, that's such a dumb one. It's a guy came to me and talked about building a house, and then he went to one of my so-called best friends, and who told him that he would do the house and don't.
Oh, I thought it was.
So
I thought only the artist decided to dispense with having an architect involved in the project at all, and that they were doing.
Yeah, they were doing it, and they're doing it, and it's. I think it may even be built. And so it was just a friendship thing where I said, look, if you want to stay friends with me, you're going to give me. I want to do a piece in the house. And so he said, okay, you do the stairway. And the more we got into it, the more the stairway became there was a different standard for me as an architect.
And what happens when the roles are reversed? Do you have a different standard for artists?
Well, I've never tried to get an artist involved in a project. I feel like it's an insult to ask an artist to do a piece in front of a building, so I never do it.
But you're currently involved in the collaboration, and how does that work?
so far.
Do you want to tell us about that briefly?
Well, it's something from the Architectural League that where I guess 10 artists and 10 architects are working together on a project to create to solve or work on an architectural element, whatever that is, and
a realizable project.
A realizable project. Okay. And I've been working with Richard Serra on a bridge project to build a bridge, and it's kind of a fantasy, but it's Richard Serra has done a film on a bridge, which is a spectacular film, and he's very interested in it, and asked me to work with him on this project as a not as a technical consultant. And then along came this Architectural League project, so we fit into that. And we're just, we're not sure where it's going to go. The idea is that we're going to work on on what a bridge is, and a bridge is everything. A bridge is talking and space between, and very Oriental philosophy. It's mind-boggling what a bridge is. And our hope is to find a specific site and design a specific bridge for that specific site eventually.
Have you located a site, I hope?
No.
One of the works of art that you did manage to create, however, is your very own house. And it is a house that I guess has been described as a bit, at least originally, of suburban anonymity. It was a two-storied gambrel roof clapboard house, which was the original structure. You proceeded to build a 1 1/2 story high wall of corrugated metal around it, but nonetheless, that wall permits the original structure to poke up from inside the new structure. Can you tell us what your intentions were there?
It had to do with my wife. She found this nice house, and I love my wife, so she found this cute little house with antiques in it, and very sweet little thing. And we were having a lot of problems getting a house.
This house is in Santa Monica.
Yeah, so we bought it at the height of the real estate boom. We paid the highest price possible.
$160,000.
$160,000.
That's a lot of money.
A year earlier, it was 40.
Mm-hmm.
Talk about desperate moves. I always do that. And we could have lived in that house fine. There's enough room in it and everything. Just
a pink stucco house with a green
no, it was pink asbestos shingles over white clapboard. It had several layers on it. Mm-hmm. Anyway, it was already layered, which is
That's part of the appeal to you.
It's a heavy term these days, layering. Anyway, I decided to get into a dialogue with the old house, which is not different, you know, what I was saying about the Ron Davis house, where the interiors would become a dialogue of a different aesthetic with the new building. Here I had it easy because the old house was already a different aesthetic, and I could play off of it. So but I wanted to explore the relationship between the two, and I got fascinated with the idea that the old house should appear to remain totally intact from the outside, and that you could look through the new house and see the old house as though it was now packaged in this new skin. And the new skin, the windows in the new house would be of a totally different aesthetic than the windows in the old house, so that they would constantly be in tension or whatever with each other. And even there, I wanted each window to have a different aesthetic, which I didn't accomplish. It's really hard.
So the old house was the core, and the new house is the wrapper. And you, of course, used a number of the materials that are familiar in your own vocabulary: metal and plywood and glass and chain link fencing, all of them very inexpensive. So on the one hand, the house looks unfinished and rough, so to speak.
Yeah, and I'm not sure if it's finished or not.
You're not sure?
No.
Is one ever sure, or?
It's confusing, though. I was wondering the other day what effect this had on my family. Because because I've noticed my wife leaves papers and stuff around on the tables, and so that there's a kind of a chaos happening in the organization of the house, or the organization of how we live in the house. And I was beginning to think that it has something to do with her not knowing whether I'm finished or not.
Well, I thought there might have been another cue, if I may, that you have given to the occupants, and that is even when that house was photographed, as contrasted to most photographs with 3 perfect lilies in one place and 2 books in another, you had, what do you call it, that you washed, soap powder for the kitchen sink, on the kitchen sink, some of the doors open. It was very much a lived-in environment, and I assumed, and in fact it was quite evident, that this was a deliberate structuring of a photo to reflect an environment in which people, real people, lived real lives.
Well, it wasn't structuring the photo. What happens every time somebody...
It was taking a photo of the way you lived.
Yeah, well, what happens is when the photographers... I've had a lot of photographers there now, and each one comes in and has a different idea of how the place should look. And so they start moving the furniture around, and if I get there on time, I start putting everything back.
But that's contrary to what you originally wanted, this flexible room. But you're the user and they're not.
Right.
So it really should respond to your needs.
Well, I like the comfortable feeling of just having this stuff all around.
How did you feel about the reaction of some of your neighbors who felt less than comfortable and somewhat, perhaps even surprised and sometimes originally angered and startled by what you had done to a house that was the pride of their neighborhood, they felt?
I was disgusted with myself.
Oh, no. But you had quite an elaborate community outreach that you had to involve yourself.
There were only a few people. There was an architect down the street whose house is covered with fake stone, who tried to get the building department to put me in jail.
They just didn't want to give you a certificate.
There was a lawyer a lady lawyer down the street who has a cute little postmodern house with the columns and the pediment. She's very avant-garde, and
except she did it 30 years ago.
Yeah, and she said she tried every way possible to sue me. I got very angry at first. I felt like I was misunderstood and being abused and all that. And but the lawyer down the street stopped me dead. She said, "I don't like your house, and she says, I tried every way I could to sue you. But she says, I can't do anything now. You're totally legal." And she said, "Quit yelling at me. Quit." I called her all kinds of names. And she said, "Just stop. I'm going to be your neighbor. Explain what you were trying to do. That's all I want to know." And that stopped me short. And I realized that I owed them that. So I did. Whenever anybody asks, I explain it to them. I take them in. I show them the views, show them what I thought I was doing and why. And it has diffused some of the anger and misunderstanding. And it's made me feel better because it's sort of childish not to realize. I mean, I'm not totally in touch with the rupture. It looks great to me, you see. So.
Did you explain to your family what your intentions were when you placed the dining room in the driveway?
See, it always comes out like I'm being
No.
funny, actually, and I like that idea because it means
Well,
you're
I thought
not
that was part of your intent. Because,
taking it so seriously, but I'm very serious about everything I do.
well, after we finish the discussion of this, you might describe what I just referred to, because that does relate to, again, the inside and the outside, and the former driveway
Yeah.
is now the existing dining room in between the first structure and its wrapper.
What did you ask me?
I've answered it too.
Oh.
But let's go on to your more serious work, because all the while that we are talking about some of these smaller and more experimental projects.
Why do you say more serious? I guess I invite that.
Really
People
the
do
reference
ask.
that you've used,
Yeah.
both yourself now and in conversation before. Would you care to change that
It's all of
reference?
one piece, actually. It's just that some work, larger commercial work, by its nature requires more compromise. When you do a shopping center, you got to put a department store at each end, and it's a straight. I mean, there are rules of those games that I'm not allowed to tinker with. If you accept those projects, which I do.
Well, you've said in the past that the larger the scale of the work, the more one is forced to compromise.
Right.
And I think you've even said that's why you need and enjoy these smaller projects.
Right.
But your practice has always struck a balance between straightforward and experimental work and between large-scale and small-scale commissions. In fact, you are in the process of doing the largest work that you have ever done. It's the $60 million Rouse project that I referred to earlier. Can you describe that for us briefly?
It's the program is a typical suburban shopping center, only it's in town. And so all the parking is in parking decks. And it's just a tight little 10-acre thing with a lot of 2 department stores and a lot of 3 levels of shopping and 2,000 cars. And it's all jumbled together. And I was able to I was interested in changing the scale of those shopping center interiors where you go from court to a narrow to court to narrow, and it's sort of amorphic and it's just formless space, and tried to make, again, different architectural statements along the way, which which are hard to do, but. And I was able to get the central court as a separate building. The outside has small vest pocket parks, I guess you'd call them. The entrances are set back, and each one of those has a different character, or tried to. But they tend. One of the things that the client did agree with me on in this project was that in a suburban location, maybe it made some sense to make it all a homogeneous kind of architecture, although I'm not sure even there it couldn't be done differently. But in the case of a downtown where there are a lot of old buildings, new buildings, and the texture, I wanted to keep it in the texture, the language of the existing downtown.
What were the materials you used?
No. Chain link, and there's a garage that's 300 feet long, 6 stories high, that's covered with a curtain of chain link. It's just hung like a curtain in front of it. And the rest is stucco, and one of the garages is covered with metal, not corrugated, just plain.
You made reference several times during our conversation to the cardboard furniture that you have designed in the early 60s. And it's a reference that I think is particularly striking because for a very long while you have been interested in both the economically and aesthetically affordable, and it fits in obviously with your use of, so to speak, cheap materials. Would you tell us a little bit about this line of furniture that I think is quite splendid, and I don't know if it's ever really reached a wider audience. I saw it long before I ever saw you, but I've only seen it, frankly, in one place quite a long while ago. And if you would describe this laminated cardboard furniture and what has happened to it.
Well, the idea still exists. I have a... It was a difficult time for me because it's the material. It was shown at Bloomingdale's, and they were selling it as in retail, and they were selling a lot of it.
How durable is that?
It's held up very well. 10 years, 20, 15 years. I have pieces that are... Let's see, I started in about 68, 69. So they're still around. There's a piece at the Museum of Modern Art in the basement. I hope everybody will take a run on the place and request
The
it.
study center.
They don't like it when you come and ask for it. It was just, it started to have a life of its own, and the life of its own would have taken me away from architecture. That's the simple. If I had made an arrangement where I got a royalty, the thing would have worked. But the people that backed it didn't want that kind of relationship. They wanted me to be, if they were going to put in money, they wanted me to be more personally hooked to it. And it was a frightening thing when I got to Bloomingdale's and saw people buying it and coming at me from all sides, and I couldn't hack it.
You don't feel that way when they use either a shopping center or a building?
No, because I don't have to continue in the involvement. The corrugated could have become probably, at least for a short time, a fairly big business, judging from the way the people who wanted to support it and back it. And I think that it could still be done. I'm surprised that somebody else hasn't used it or done it. I have patents. I hold the patent rights, but I don't know.
So then, do you see your work as part of, be it furniture or a building, as part of a larger stylistic trend that others should participate in? Or do you see your own work as...
Well, I think of necessity, we're probably going to have to participate, just looking at the way the economy's going. I mean, you're having to build cheaper and cheaper. At least the clients I have are...
Has your work been imitated, do you feel, by other architects as yet?
I hope not. I haven't seen any imitators. Oh, you know, people use corrugated metal, people use chain link, but it's not, I mean, I didn't invent chain link and I didn't invent corrugated metal. So I hope they... I'm not trying to start a school of architecture. I am trying to respond to a particular time, because I don't think you can escape. I don't believe you can jump out of your time, out of your milieu. And I think maybe there's some relevance in terms of the economy, in terms of understanding that you can make buildings with that don't have to be quite so completely finished, and that there's a value in it in terms of livability, in terms of people being able to bang nails in the wall and stuff, that everything isn't... It can survive and be strong without all of the perfectly organized furniture. And
is that what you mean when you refer to invisible architecture?
Oh, God, you have to ask me that one. I had a funny notion that you could make architecture that was, that you would bump into before you would realize it was architecture, or it was, you know, something. And I deluded myself with that idea for a long time. And obviously, I haven't been able to do it. I'd love to do that. Probably Venturi gets closer to doing that than anybody I know.
And how do you compare your aesthetic and the intent of using everyday and familiar materials to the way he does?
I think it's quite different. He's into a kind of a story, a verbal polemic I don't know. It doesn't fit the same groove. I'm really interested in this hands-on thing, and not telling stories.
Well, we're really interested in what you told us this evening, including the stories, and thank you for sharing your innovative and imaginative design ideas with us. It's little wonder why your colleagues on both coasts regard you with such respect. Thank you very much for coming to be with us tonight, Frank Gehry, and thank you, audience, for coming too.